Hi, everyone. Welcome to this edition of the Human School's Curation Corner, just one part of our learning journey here at the Human School. I'm Randy.
I'm Rachel.
And I'm Chad.
In each episode of the Curation Corner, we engage in brief conversations focused on a specific resource. First, we summarize the author's ideas. Then we make connections to our own experiences. And finally, we share insights and some additional questions that can further our learning. In this episode, we're chatting about the article, Learning Loss is a Myth: How a Racist, Classist Lie is Threatening a Generation, by Mario Mabruco. If you're interested in the article, you can find a link below this video at the Human School. So what's the author saying? And there are basically 4 points, and it's about this idea or this phrase that we're hearing a lot of these days, learning loss, as a result of so many months of traditional learning being disrupted by the pandemic and being replaced mostly with online learning. So he makes 4 points. Learning loss is based on bad data. Learning loss is inherently racist. Learning loss is a capitalist tool. And learning loss is ruining student mental health. And you can probably tell just from those 4 points, this is an objector. This is somebody who's objecting to the phrase, the learning loss, and believing that it's actually very damaging to kids and that we should stop using it. So the connection that I'm making here is that we've been operating in the system that was designed for standardization. And that is the lens that we're looking at this idea of learning loss through. And it's a problem because if we begin to challenge this root assumption that standardization is not a good thing, at least the way that it's appears in our schools, then the idea of learning loss, we really can look under the hood and see how damaging it is. So it's this idea to me that we're looking at this through that standardization lens. And if we change that lens, what does that look like? What do you guys think?
Yeah, I was thinking about the same thing, and I was thinking in particular about standardized testing and how so much of this kind of iteration of traditional schooling came out of a panic around a different study and a different set of data that looked at our schools are failing and decided that we needed to have some massive standardization around standards themselves, around testing to determine success of schools and success of teachers, and that things like teacher evaluations became so heavily based on this one set of data, and that it's almost a running joke that the equation that they use to figure out how successful a school is like something 5 people know. And so, when we think about what learning is and how we measure it, and this massive industry that's been created as a result is all a result of this panicked study that we're deciding is real and worthwhile and is testing all the right things in all the right ways without any additional context or differences or disparities, and that the learning loss conversation kind of spins off of that. When the author talks about it being a capitalist tool for money making, a lot of that original study was too, to justify privatization of schooling, to justify all of these programs that were being purchased, or these like rescue solutions for different schools, people to hire experts across the board, but also in some ways to justify the public not having to pay for schooling, that the end result is that the private entity is more successful and is going to be better at the end of it all. That if you don't pass all of these leaps and bounds and jump through all of these hoops and you don't meet all of the data points that you're supposed to, the end result is a justification of privatizing your school, essentially, by having people coming in and fixing it for you, is just wild. So that really pushed a button for me, and it spun a lot of the history of schooling that we've seen, especially in the last 40 years.
For me, I learning loss is very much like the phrase summer slide for me, which is, so this idea is not a new concept for a lot of people. And I think that what's always kind of interesting, even about summer slide, is I've had this suspicion that well, let me start here. Is like, I'm not always a huge fan of the standardized assessments to begin with, but when we benchmark kids, beginning, middle, and end of the year, we oftentimes want to benchmark our kids like the first week or first or second week of school, because we want to get that very clear picture of where they're at come September. But I've always had this suspicion, and I can't justify or verify this, but if you waited a month until October, that what you would see is you'd see a lot of that learning loss that happened over the summer, that summer slide, mitigated by students getting back into the routine of school, which I think is really kind of an interesting and telling thought, in that, what do our kids really lose over the summer? But they lose the structures of school. Kids go home in the summertime and they move into a very different, in theory, a very different environment, at least many of our kids do, than the 8 hours, cells and bells routine that occurs. And so I've had this suspicion that when kids leave school for 2 months in the summertime, it's not so much that they're losing their content knowledge, which we know they do. I mean, the statistics are as high as 90% of the academic content knowledge that kids learn in school, they lose before they graduate. So I think there's that. The other thing that I keep coming back to with the pandemic is this idea of loss. We're again focusing on the wrong kind of loss. We're focusing on the academic loss, not the social loss, right? And so schools, even though they are doing an incredible job of talking about social emotional learning and trying to build these processes in, it's oftentimes justified by increasing test scores. The reason why we do these things is because it's going to increase achievement. So it's founded on this structure, this belief that what learning is through that almighty test score and that achievement data. And yeah, I mean, I know that that's a really cynical way of thinking about things, but the truth is, I think many places can justify doing this work because it ties back to our kids will learn better, they'll achieve more if we have programs in place which support their learning. So it's interesting to me, when we talk about learning loss or summer slide, that again, it always comes back to the wrong thing. So do I think that our kids lost quite a bit during the pandemic? Sure. I also think, and this may be an unpopular thing to say, they gained some insight, right? They realized that the structure of what they're being asked to do, when you're given this space and freedom to make your own decisions about your day, and now you're forced back into a structure and system that doesn't really work for you anymore. We keep framing it through loss, but our kids gain some insights. And I think that what you're hearing a lot of educators talk about is kids are not playing school very well. And I don't know that anyone right now is dealing all that well with that component.
So one of the final points that he makes is that learning loss is ruining student mental health, and this idea that we're labeling students negatively. What other ways do we label students? Because clearly, I think most of us aren't even seeing that, recognizing that as a negative, damaging kind of label, deficit model, as they say. So what are the ways do we negatively label kids? Because I think this kind of goes to our curation compass point and the idea of stories over numbers, and we're using the numbers to just come up with this negative learning loss label. So any thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the places where schools inherently do it is that when students get labeled, learning disabled or they have a learning disability, they're defined by a label, or they have a Section 504 plan. They're a 504 kid. They're autistic. It doesn't. The label that we put on kids doesn't define who they are. And quite honestly, there are students who have an IEP in a building, and they have one goal, and that goal might be a behavioral goal. And yet there is an implication that the kid is not capable of any type of schoolwork because they have an IEP. So labels are an incredibly dangerous, it's just an incredibly dangerous thing to have in a school, because the assumption is it strips away the uniqueness, right? So if we believe that each, learner is unique and capable and able to, contribute to the world, the labels are the things that kind of get in the way of that, because people make these broad assumptions. And the way that we talk about how contexts are different, you can't take something, pick it up and move it to a new context because the context is different. The same is true of our learners. So that's one way that's clear to me in schools, that once a kid is given, an IEP for whatever those goals are, we've got students who might have an IEP goal around literacy, and there's an assumption that they can't do math, or they can't engage in science, or they can't go to art, or they can't, because they have an IEP goal to support this one thing that maybe they need a little bit of additional support. So I find that highly problematic.
One that's been really bothering me a lot lately is the historically underperforming student category. That language bugs me to no end. That, it's such a huge fixation for schools because it's part of their evaluation, and it's part of the way that they have, targeted improvement plans and things like that. And that idea of the historically underperforming, as if for always this group of kids performs less than what we think that they should, right? And it ties for me to the part of the article where he talks about learning loss as racist, and that so much of our expectations and our standards are through one lens: white, upper middle class, with the resources that you need and that you deserve, with the home situation in a certain way, with a certain amount of support and a certain trajectory. And then anything that doesn't fit into that mold is considered underperforming or failing. And then that data is then ignored. The conversation around learning loss is something that's particular to mostly white suburban students, and not to Black and urban living students. Is something that I think falls similarly into that category, and also goes back to what I was saying before around standardization, that there is a specific set of information that we've decided is valuable, and that when students don't meet that set of information, we believe, similarly to what Chad said, that then all things that they're capable of are flawed and failing and not possible. I remember in one of my early jobs, I had at the end of the year, was recommending students for honors English in 10th grade, and had a conversation with my administrator where she told me that I was not allowed to recommend students with an IEP to honors English class, because she could not fathom that a student with an IEP might have a math goal that has nothing to do with English. She really believed that the IEP meant that they were incapable in all areas, and that there are some levels of this. We hear it with our technical school kids, tech kids, IEP kids, 504 kids, poor kids, that these labels really prevent us from seeing all of the ways that they are successful, and that they are incredibly capable, and more capable in some ways, because the original barometer that we're using, the original measuring stick, is flawed, and we don't even notice that. And the label allows us to reinforce that belief over and over and over again, that we don't start looking at whether or not the numbers to begin with are flawed. The formula is flawed. And as a result, it creates incredibly low expectations that then follow students throughout the entirety of schooling, but also never creates space for them to be successful in the ways that they are successful, because we have decided that school should look like this box, and anything outside of the box is wrong, or not good enough, or not important.
So I think one of the insights that I pulled from this is something that I've been saying for a long time, which is that we within the system are really frustrated by how the system defines success. So standardized test scores, here in Pennsylvania, Future Ready, index, the narrative around how we are or are not viewed as successful. But as systems, we have not taken the opportunity to tell that new story and create a new narrative with our community around what success is. So we've accepted those conditions. And so I think about the objector mindset. While this gentleman or the author of this article, is clearly an objector to this idea of learning loss, I think one of the things that we probably have we've definitively not done a good job of is redefining success based on our context. We have not said, these are the things that we value as a community as a group of stakeholders, and this is how we're going to measure our success. And so a phrase like learning loss or summer slide, that language likely would not creep in to a local community who was busy defining what we want for success. And I think this goes beyond the profile of a graduate work, which is all good and interesting work, but it drives towards what are all the different ways, what's the new story that we're going to tell. So to me, the language here of learning loss is a byproduct of really the system, but also our failure within the system to define what we really value and how we measure that through lenses that are not directly tied to standardized test scores, as explicitly as they are.
So my insight and curiosity is that our system is so ingrained in standardization that we don't even realize it when these kinds of issues come up. We can't seem to look at this issue particularly through that lens. We don't realize it. We don't realize that we're thinking that the standardized system has continued to chug along and our students have been static for the last 2 years, and that now there's this big learning gap. But that should challenge us to challenge the assumption behind standardization. And I wish, and I'm thinking, like, what can we do, each of us and each of the people that are listening and watching, what can we do to help surface that big assumption? And this is just one thing. This is just learning loss we're talking about. What are all the other damaging practices that we have that are rooted in this standardization mindset that we have, that we don't even realize that we have, that just sort of permeates society and particularly education? Any insights, Rachel?
One of the questions that I keep coming back to, and even outside of this conversation, is as we see data over and over again that can reinforce the opinion that we have, you can find information that will back up whatever you want to believe. So how do we decide when we talk about curation, how do we decide which stories and which numbers to value and to trust, for lack of a better word? And how can we start making decisions around learning amid that conflicting information? And for me, some of it is being able to look at the multiple stories that are told by the data, as opposed to just the stories that reinforce what we think. But that question of how do we decide, and how do we kind of break out of this position that we're in currently, of just reading the data and the stories that reinforce what we believe.
Mm-hmm.
Rachel, to your insight, I wonder, how often decisions are being made only by the numbers in a spreadsheet, right? So, to your point, what are all the different data? And I guess when I think about data, I always think about it purely through numbers. And I have a preference to the word evidence, but I wonder how frequently someone looks at the numbers on a spreadsheet and they make a quick decision. Well, our 3-year trend over time shows that our 7th grade ELA data so our 7th grade ELA teachers must be bad. And there's no other conversation around who those teachers are, who the learners are in those classrooms, what other experiences kids are having in those classroom spaces. So I think there's all these amazing questions that could be asked from the data that I'm guessing probably don't, and people probably don't have the time or capacity or the desire to ask those questions. So that to me, that your question, your insight really kind of resonated with me.
And speaking of questions, let's wrap this up with a couple of questions from our group here. 3 questions we have for our viewers to think about. What are your learners saying they lost during the pandemic? How do we decide which numbers and which stories to value? How can we make decisions about learning amid conflicting information? And lastly, how do we tell a new story about learning that's not driven by academic achievement and instead defined by a new model focused on our community's beliefs and values? And I think you heard all those threads through our conversation today. So hopefully some things for you to think about, discuss amongst each other, discuss in the comments of this video, and hopefully we can move this conversation forward. Thanks, everyone, for learning alongside us today on this episode of the Human Schools Curation Corner. Join us in today's conversation in the Learning in Public Hub at thehuman.school or on our YouTube channel. The Human School. By placing humanity at the center of all design, the Human School seeks to share an evolving story of learning and its impact on the world. We can't wait to hear how you are intentionally placing humanity at the center. And for additional resources, visit thehuman.school and the Learning in Public Hub and join the community committed to placing humanity at the center of all design. Thanks again, folks.
Bye, everyone.
See you around. Bye-bye.